Hwan Seok had survived 3 assassination attempts and built an empire on the Busan docks, yet he was being hollowed out by a hunger no amount of territory could satisfy. He was the undisputed Iron King, a man who commanded thousands and owned the very horizon, yet he lived in a state of hypervigilance so cold it turned every luxury into ash. Each night, he sat at the center of a mahogany fortress, surrounded by armed shadows who moved with lethal precision, staring at gourmet plates he couldn't bring himself to trust. He knew the truth his doctors couldn't diagnose. He wasn't dying of a physical ailment. Ill was the weight of a life where every smile was a calculated lie and every meal felt like a transaction. He was starving for a single moment of sincerity in a world built on fear. While Seok ruled from his cliffside throne, Aisha Coleman stood in a sweltering back kitchen, adjusting the crisp white collar of a uniform that served as her only armor against a world trying to make her feel small. She was a woman of quiet strength, working double shifts to save a family legacy that was slipping through her fingers, her face a mask of composed tension. She didn't know that by overhearing a whispered conversation near the walk-in freezer, she had just picked up a burden that would shatter her anonymity. She only knew that as she walked toward the VIP dining room, a small, folded note was burning a hole beneath the plate she carried. As she presented the perfectly seared steak to the man with the predator's eyes, she realized the danger too late. She hadn't just delivered a warning, she had signed her life over to a king who never let go of what he found valuable. And Aisha Coleman adjusted the white collar of her uniform, ensuring it was as crisp as the morning air biting at the Busan docks. To anyone passing by the bustling harbor kitchens, she was just another cog in the massive machine of the Iron King's latest gala. But to Aisha, the uniform was her armor. Every line had to be straight, every button secured. It was a ritual of dignity she performed daily, a silent refusal to let the grime of her circumstances dull the sharp edges of her ambition. She worked with a quiet, measured strength, her movements a choreography of necessity developed through years of navigating a world that often looked through her rather than at her. The gala was a sea of excess, a sharp contrast to the salty industrial reality of the docks outside. Inside the service corridors, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive oils and the frantic energy of 100 subordinates trying to perfect a world for a man who famously tolerated nothing less. Aisha moved through the chaos like a shadow, her face a mask of professional neutrality. She was here for one reason: to secure the bonus that would keep her family's small, struggling shop from being swallowed by the rising debts of a changing city. She was prepping a tray of appetizers in a secluded alcove near the walk-in freezer when the world tilted. The heavy hum of the industrial fans usually drowned out the whispers of the kitchen staff, but a sudden lull in the clatter of pans allowed 2 voices to cut through the air like a knife. They weren't speaking of recipes or guest lists. "The second course," a low, gravelly voice hissed, the tone jagged with a desperation Aisha recognized all too well. "That's when the distraction starts. By the time Hwan Seok realizes the wine is bitter, the perimeter guards will already be blind. It's been paid for." Aisha froze, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't dare move, her fingers still curled around a silver serving tong. The air in the corridor suddenly felt thin, the luxury of the dining room beyond now seeming like a gilded trap. She knew that voice. It belonged to one of the senior leads, someone Seok likely trusted to keep his world secure. "And the girl?" the second voice asked, a cold, clinical sound. "She's just a waitress. If she's in the way, she's part of the price." The footsteps receded, leaving Aisha in a silence so heavy it felt physical. She looked down at her hands, and they were trembling, a betrayal of the composure she worked so hard to maintain. She was a vulnerable outsider in a city of iron, a woman whose skin and status usually made her invisible. She knew the rules of Busan: you stay in your lane, you keep your head down, and you never ever cross the Hwan Syndicate. But as she looked at the pristine white of her apron, she realized she couldn't just stand by. Her empathy, the very trait she often felt was a weakness in this hard city, wouldn't allow her to watch a man be led to a slaughter. even a man as feared as the Iron King. With a deep, steadying breath, she reached into her pocket for a scrap of order paper. Her fingers flew as she scribbled a frantic warning, her handwriting a jagged testament to her fear. She knew the risk, but as she stepped back into the light of the gala, and she realized too late that she wasn't just delivering a message, she was stepping into a fire that would never let her go. Hwan Seok sat in a silence so profound it seemed to push back against the muffled roar of the gala outside. His eyes remained fixed on the space where the waitress had stood just moments before, his mind replaying the way her hands had trembled, not with the clumsy fear of a subordinate, but with the frantic energy of someone carrying a weight they weren't meant to bear. With a movement so slow it felt predatory, he reached out and slid the small, folded scrap of paper from beneath the rim of his plate. As he unfolded the note, his expression didn't change, but the air around him grew cold. The handwriting was jagged, a frantic script that screamed of a courage born from desperation. The wine is bitter at the second course. The perimeter is blind. Trust no one. Seok didn't blink. He had lived his entire life waiting for the next blade to find his back, but he had never expected the warning to come from a girl whose skin and uniform made her invisible to the very men currently plotting his end. He didn't call for his guards to secure the room. Instead, he stood, his tall, imposing figure casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the light of the chandelier above. "Minho," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the thoughts of his right-hand man. "Find the girl, the one who served the steak." "Sir, we need to evacuate," Minho urged, his eyes darting to the wine bottles being uncorked across the room. "If the perimeter is compromised—" "I am not fleeing from shadows," Seok interrupted, his gaze sharp and assessing. "I want the woman who gave me this. She hasn't left the grounds yet. Bring the car around to the service exit. Now." Outside, the humid night air of the Busan docks clung to Aisha as she hurried toward the employee transit area. Her heart was a trapped bird, beating against her ribs with a violence that made her lightheaded. She had done it. She had passed the warning. Now, all she had to do was disappear back into the gray grime of her life and hope the Iron King was as smart as they said he was. She reached the edge of the gala's manicured grounds, the industrial skeleton of the harbor rising up to meet her, when the low, powerful hum of an engine vibrating through the pavement made her freeze. A black sedan, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the cold harbor lights, and swept around the corner with predatory grace, blocking her path. The door opened, and Hwan Seok stepped out. He didn't look like a man who was fleeing a coup. He looked like a god of iron deciding the fate of a mortal. He moved toward her, his pace deliberate, his presence so overwhelming that Aisha felt the world narrowing until there was nothing but the scent of sea salt and expensive tobacco. He stopped inches from her, the note held between two fingers. "You realized the danger too late, didn't you, Aisha Coleman?" he asked, his voice a low confession in the dark. He watched the way her eyes read as nervous but controlled, the way she refused to look small even as her shoulders tightened. "You didn't just deliver a message. You gave me your loyalty. A gift I didn't ask for, and one I certainly won't let walk away." Aisha looked at the black car, then back at the man who never let go of what he found valuable. She realized then that by trying to save his life, she had forfeit the only thing she had left, her anonymity. The predator had found his interest, and the cage was already closing. The drive to the Hwan estate was a silent, suffocating journey through the winding coastal roads of Busan. Aisha sat in the back of the reinforced sedan, the plush leather seating feeling less like luxury and more like the interior of a coffin. Outside, the moon fractured against the black expanse of the East Sea, but inside, the only light came from the glowing dashboard and the occasional flicker of Seok-jin's lighter. He didn't speak, but his presence was a physical weight, and a gravitational force that kept her pinned to her seat. When the car finally slowed, it wasn't at a house, but at a fortress. Perched precariously on the jagged cliffs of Hyundai, the estate was a masterwork of glass, steel, and cold intent. As the iron gates hissed shut behind them, Aisha felt the finality of it. She had stepped out of the world she knew and into a sovereign territory where the only law was the man sitting beside her. The door was opened by a man whose face looked as though it had been carved from the very cliffside. He didn't offer a hand. He stood like a sentinel, his eyes raking over Aisha's stained uniform with a blatant, cold suspicion. This was the elite guard, the men who had bled for the Hwan name, and to them, she was a variable they hadn't accounted for, a potential leak in a system that demanded absolute purity. "The guest wing," Seokjin commanded, his voice cutting through the sound of the crashing waves below. He stepped out of the car, not looking back to see if Aisha followed. He knew she would. There was nowhere else to go. Aisha walked through the echoing marble foyer, her footsteps sounding like a heartbeat against the stone. Everywhere she looked, there were eyes. Men in tailored black suits stood at every interval, their postures rigid, their expressions unreadable. She could feel their silent judgment, a jagged resentment that she, a waitress from the docks, had been brought into the inner sanctum of the Iron King. "She wasn't cleared," one guard muttered to another as she passed, his voice low but intended to be heard. So Aisha didn't flinch. She kept her chin parallel to the floor, her quiet strength acting as a shield against the atmosphere of lethal skepticism. She was terrified, her heart still a trapped bird in her chest, but she refused to look small. She had spent her life being underestimated. She would not let them see her crumble now. They reached a set of heavy oak doors at the end of a long, glass-walled corridor that looked out over the abyss. The guard who had escorted her stopped and turned, his hand hovering near his jacket. "You stay in these rooms," he said, his tone devoid of warmth. "You do not wander. You do not touch anything. To us you are a distraction he doesn't need. Remember that." He pulled the door open, revealing a suite that was more opulent than the entirety of her family's home, yet it felt barren. The air was sterile, a smelling of ozone and expensive wax. As the guards retreated and the lock clicked with a heavy mechanical finality, Aisha stood in the center of the room. She was safe from the betrayal in the kitchen, perhaps, but as she looked at her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows, she realized she was now a prisoner in a gilded cage, guarded by wolves who were only waiting for their master to look away. The following evening, the gilded cage felt smaller, the air within it charged with the anticipation of a predator finally ready to inspect its catch. Aisha had been instructed to dress, not in her servant's whites, but in a simple, elegant black dress provided by the estate. It felt like a second skin, one that marked her not as a waitress but as a person of interest. When the guards escorted her to a private dining balcony overlooking the churning black waves of the harbor, she found Hwan Seok waiting. He was seated at a small table, the top buttons of his shirt open, looking more relaxed than she had ever seen him, yet his eyes remained as sharp as shards of obsidian. He didn't rise, but he gestured toward the seat opposite him. Between them sat a meal of startling simplicity, bowls of steaming rice and a clear, fragrant broth. "Eat," he commanded, his voice a low vibration that seemed to harmonize with the distant crashing of the sea. Aisha sat, her posture as straight and disciplined as always. She picked up her chopsticks, but her gaze never left his. "You didn't bring me here for the food, Mr. Hwan." Seok watched her, his expression an unreadable mask of assessing power. "In my world, everyone has a price, Aisha. Some want money to settle debts. Others want power to crush their enemies. And some, the most dangerous kind, want favor so they can betray you later." He leaned forward, his chest open, projecting an energy that was both calm and terrifying. "I've spent 24 hours looking into your life. Your family shop is failing. You've worked 3 jobs for 2 years. You are the perfect candidate for a bribe. So tell me, what was your angle?" The accusation hung in the salt-thickened air. Aisha felt a spark of the quiet strength that had sustained her through the grime of the docks. She set her chopsticks down with a soft click. You think I warned you because I wanted a seat at this table? You think I risked my life to become a line item in your ledger? People don't give away loyalty for free, Seok-jin countered, his voice narrowing. It's a transaction. Always. Aisha looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the profound isolation that billions couldn't cure. Then you've lived a very lonely life, she said, her voice steady and devoid of the fear the guards expected. I didn't overhear that plot and think about my debt. I thought about a man being led to a slaughter while his friends smiled at him. I gave you that note because I couldn't live with the alternative. It wasn't a trade, Mr. Hwan. It was the truth. Seok-jin went still. It was a stillness not of threat, but of genuine shock. He had spent decades deciphering the hidden motives of vipers. Yet here was a woman who spoke with a sincerity that tasted like the first fresh air he had breathed in years. He looked at her focused eyes, reading the nervous but controlled fire within them, and realized she was telling the truth. She hadn't wanted his money or his power, she had simply refused to watch him die. For the first time, the predator's gaze softened. He reached across the table, his hand pausing just inches from hers. You are either the bravest woman I have ever met, he whispered, or the most foolish. But you are the only one who has ever given me something I didn't have to buy. The stillness of the cliffside estate was deceptive, a polished veneer of safety that Aisha was beginning to realize was as thin as ice. Late that night, the silence of her suite was punctured by the soft, mechanical hiss of the door sliding open. It wasn't the heavy, rhythmic tread of the guards or Seok-jin's deliberate, predatory step. This was a frantic scraping sound, the sound of someone moving in the shadows they were supposed to protect. Aisha sat up, her focused eyes adjusting to the dim moonlight spilling across the marble floor. A figure loomed in the doorway, the silhouette familiar but distorted by a jagged desperation. It was one of the senior guards who had stood behind Seok-jin at the gala, his face now a mask of panicked sweat. In his hand, the cold blue glint of a silenced pistol caught the light. You should have stayed in the kitchen, girl, he hissed, his voice trembling with the weight of the betrayal he had already committed. He's looking at you like you're the answer to a question he's been asking for 20 years. If you're gone, he goes back to being the man we can control. Aisha didn't scream. Her shoulders went tight, her body instinctively falling into the upright, disciplined posture that had sustained her on the docks. You're the one who sold him out, she said, her voice a calm contrast to his frantic energy. You're killing me because I saw the truth you're trying to hide. As the traitor raised the weapon, a sudden, violent crash shook the very foundation of the room. The glass wall overlooking the ocean didn't shatter. It seemed to explode inward as Hwan Seok surged through the side entrance, a force of nature fueled by a cold, incandescent rage. Before the guard could pull the trigger, Seok was upon him. The violence that followed was not the calculated move of a businessman. It was the raw, protective fury of a predator whose most valuable possession had been threatened. Seok-jin's hands, usually so still and controlled, were a blur of motion. He disarmed the man with a sickening crack of bone, slamming him against the wall with such force that the plaster spiderwebbed. "In my house?" Seok-jin's voice was a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to rattle the floorboards. He didn't look at the traitor's face. His eyes were fixed on Aisha, checking for a scratch, a bruise, any sign of damage. "You dared to touch what is mine?" The guard gasped for air, his eyes bulging with terror. "She's a nobody, Seok-jin, a waitress. She's making you weak." Seok-jin's grip tightened around the man's throat, his knuckles white. "She is the only truth in this building," he whispered, his face inches from the traitor's. "Dan, you are the filth I am finally scrubbing away." With a brutal efficiency that made Aisha's breath hitch, Seok-jin neutralized the threat, signaling the loyal guards who finally swarmed the room. But as the traitor was dragged away, Seok-jin didn't return to his mask of cold stone. He turned to Aisha, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with an intensity that suggested his interest had crossed a dangerous line. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek, his stillness now vibrating with a growing, dark obsession. He had saved her life, but the way he looked at her made it clear. She was no longer just a witness to be protected. She was the only thing in his world that mattered, and he would burn the city to the ground before he let her go. The aftermath of the breach left the estate shivering in a tense electric silence. Seok-jin did not retreat to his reinforced office or call for a strategy meeting with his lieutenants. Instead, he led Aisha through a hidden glass corridor that descended toward the very base of the cliffs, where the spray of the Busan harbor misted against the panes. They reached a secluded observation deck that felt less like a room and more like a lantern hanging over the abyss. There, stripped of his guards and the artificial light of the foyer, the Iron King looked less like a predator and more like a man made of scars. He stared out at the container ships drifting like ghosts in the distance. "My father was the first to try and civilize these docks," Seok-jin began, his voice devoid of its usual predatory edge, sounding instead like the rhythmic grinding of tide against stone. "He believed that if you fed the men well and treated the harbor with respect, the harbor would give back. He wasn't a man of iron. He was a man of silk." Aisha stood beside him, her presence a steady, quiet warmth against the chill of the glass. She didn't press him. She simply waited, her focused eyes reflecting the distant harbor lights. 20 years ago, on these same docks, they showed him how little silk matters in a world of steel. Seok-jin continued, his hands tightening on the railing until his knuckles turned white. They didn't just kill him, they dismantled everything he loved while he watched, thinking his kindness was a weakness they could exploit. I was 10 years old, hiding in a crate of raw fish, smelling the salt and the blood, realizing that the only way to protect anything was to become harder than the metal that crushed him. He turned to look at her, the polished suit and the calm aura suddenly feeling like a suit of armor he was too tired to wear. "That is why there is no sincerity in my world, Aisha. Sincerity is what got my father killed. I built this empire of stone and fear because I refused to ever be that vulnerable child again. I became the Iron King so no one could ever reach my heart." Aisha reached out, her hand hesitant but firm, as she placed it over his white-knuckled grip on the rail. She felt the vibration of his tension, the legacy of a tragedy that had frozen him in time. "You became iron to survive," she whispered, her voice a soft bridge in the dark. "But iron doesn't grow, Seok-jin. It just waits to rust. Your father wasn't wrong to be silk. The world was just too cruel for him. But you aren't that boy in the crate anymore. You don't have to keep starving yourself just to stay strong." In the dim light, she saw the mask finally crack. For a fleeting second, the Iron King disappeared, and she saw the man beneath, the one who was still looking for a reason to trust the sun rising over the water. He didn't pull away from her touch. Instead, he turned his hand over, lacing his fingers with hers, a silent acknowledgement that for the first time in 2 decades, someone had seen past the fortress and found the man shivering inside. The tragedy had made him a king, but Aisha realized it was the truth that would finally make him whole. The fragile piece of the cliffside observation deck was shattered before the dawn could even touch the horizon. Intelligence had flickered through the syndicate's secure lines. The breach had been a mere opening gambit, and the mansion was no longer a fortress, but a bullseye. Seok-jin moved with a cold, frantic precision, deciding that Aisha's only chance for survival lay in a discreet safe house hidden within the industrial labyrinth of the Busan shipyards. But as their armored convoy wound through the skeletal shadows of cranes and stacked shipping containers, the air grew thick with a silence that Aisha had learned to recognize as a precursor to violence. The trap was sprung with a deafening roar. A heavy transport truck surged from a blind alley, T-boning the lead security car and grinding the convoy to a halt. Before the smoke could clear, the shipyard erupted in gunfire. Aisha felt the world tilt as Seok-jin's hand clamped onto her shoulder, pulling her down against the reinforced floor of the sedan. "Stay low," he hissed, his voice returning to that jagged, predatory edge. "Do not move until I tell you." But the rivals had planned for his protection. A flashbang detonated near the rear window, the white-hot light searing through the reinforced glass. In the disorienting blur of ringing ears and stinging eyes, the door was wrenched open. Aisha felt rough hands seize her, dragging her out into the salt-cracked air of the docks. She caught a glimpse of Seok Jin surging forward, his face a mask of incandescent fury, but a spray of suppressive fire forced him back behind the car's frame. "Drop the weapon, Iron King!" a voice bellowed from the shadows of a crane. It was Mr. Song's lead enforcer, standing 10 yards away with a blade held to Aisha's throat. Or the girl bleeds for your pride." The shipyard went unnervingly still. Seok Jin stepped out from behind the armored door, his hands raised, his tall figure silhouetted against the rising sun. For the first time in his life, the man who had built an empire on calculated risk looked truly vulnerable. His eyes were locked on Aisha, watching the way her quiet strength refused to break even as the steel pressed against her skin. She didn't scream, she didn't plead. She looked at him with a focused intensity that said she understood the stakes. "You think she's just a waitress?" Seok Jin said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to travel through the very concrete. "You think she's a weakness you can exploit? But she is the only reason I am standing here instead of burning your world to the ground." The enforcer sneered, untightening his grip. "She's a nobody, and now she's a dead nobody." "No," Aisha said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the enforcer's bravado. She leaned into the blade, her large eyes fixed on Seok Jin. "He isn't the Iron King because of his guards. He's the king because he knows exactly what his life is worth." In that split second of the enforcer's confusion, Aisha drove her elbow back into his ribs with the force of a woman who had spent years handling heavy iron on the docks. As the man stumbled, Seok Jin moved with the speed of the predator he had always been. A single, muffled shot echoed through the yard. The standoff ended not with a compromise, but with Seok Jin standing over Aisha, his body a shield against the world, his eyes burning with the realization that he would lose everything he owned just to keep her breath in her lungs. The shipyard air was thick with the copper tang of blood and the heavy, humid scent of the sea. But Hwan Seok Jin felt only a chilling clarity. Though the immediate threat of the blade had been neutralized, the perimeter was still swarming with Song's remaining enforcers, their weapons trained on the small space where Aisha leaned against the cold metal of a shipping container. The trap hadn't just been a physical one, it was a strategic strangulation. Song himself stepped from the shadows of a warehouse, holding a thick leather folder and a gold pen that caught the harsh morning light like a mocking tooth. "You're a legend of calculation, Seok Jin," Song called out, his voice smooth and oily, not lacking any of the Iron King's jagged dignity. "So calculate this. You can walk out of here with your life and your empire, leaving the girl to pay the price for your dinner warning. Or you can sign these papers, transferring the northern Busan shipping routes to me, and I'll let you both vanish into the sunrise. Your crown or the waitress? What is the soul of a kingdom worth?" Aisha looked at Seok Jin, her breath hitching as she realized the magnitude of the demand. Those roots were the veins of his empire, the source of the Hwan Syndicate's absolute power. To sign them away was to dismantle 2 decades of ruthless labor and blood. "Don't do it," she whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos. "You built that to survive. Don't throw it away for me." Seok Jin didn't hesitate. He didn't look at the papers, nor did he look at the rival boss. His focus remained entirely on Aisha, tracing the line of her jaw and the focused, nervous fire in her eyes. He realized then that the empire he had built as a shield for a 10-year-old boy was nothing more than a cage of cold iron. It had kept him safe, but it had kept him starving. He stepped toward Song, his movements slow and deliberate. With a silent, predatory grace, he took the pen. The sound of the nib scratching against the parchment was the only noise in the vast shipyard, a dry, rhythmic sound like the heartbeat of a dying era. In a few jagged strokes of ink, the Iron King abdicated his throne. He tossed the folder at Song's feet with a look of utter indifference, as if he were discarding a piece of trash rather than a fortune. "The roots are yours," Seok Jin said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that made Song's smile falter. But understand this, you didn't win them. I traded them for something you will never possess. I traded them for the truth." He turned his back on the rival enforcers, a move of supreme confidence and total dismissal, and walked toward Aisha. He reached out, his hand cupping her face with a gentleness that felt like a miracle in the grime of the docks. The blood and ink had settled the debt of his past. As he pulled her toward him, the weight of the crown gone from his shoulders, he felt a lightness he hadn't known since before the crate of raw fish. He had lost his empire, but as he looked into Aisha's eyes, he knew he had finally found his life. The predator was gone. Only the man remained. The transition was not a violent explosion, but a quiet, methodical dismantling. In the weeks that followed the standoff at the shipyard, Hwan Seok moved with a different kind of precision. He didn't use his hands to crush rivals, he used them to sign the final dissolution of the Hwan Syndicate. The Iron King was dead, buried under a mountain of legal filings and the legitimate sale of his remaining assets. He had traded the shadows of the underworld for the scorching clarity of the sun, and for the first time in 20 years, he didn't feel the need to look behind him. The morning light began to bleed across the horizon, painting the Busan harbor in shades of bruised purple and gold. Seok stood on the wooden deck of a modest, renovated storefront, nestled right at the water's edge, far from the cliffside fortress and the cold marble of his past. The air here didn't smell of ozone and sterile wax, and it smelled of salt, roasting coffee, and the spices Aisha had carried in her small bag when they first met. Aisha stepped out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a clean white apron. She didn't look like a waitress anymore, nor did she look like a prisoner. She moved with a grace and confidence that seemed to light the very room. She stopped beside him, leaning her shoulder against his, her quiet strength now a steady pillar of their shared life. "The first shipment of fresh produce arrived," she said, her voice a soft melody against the rhythmic lapping of the waves. "No bribes, no hidden fees, just a transaction based on a handshake." Seok turned to her, the predatory energy that had once defined him replaced by a calm, observant stillness. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek with a tenderness that still felt like a new language to him. "It tastes different," he admitted, his voice a low rumble that lacked its former jagged edge. "Everything does. The air, the food, the silence." He looked out at the harbor, where the cranes were beginning to stir. He was no longer the man who owned the horizon, but he was finally the man who could enjoy it. He had spent his life starving for something that didn't feel like a transaction, and he had found it in a woman who had been brave enough to slip a note under a plate and demand his humanity in return. "They used to call me the Iron King," he mused, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "They said I was indestructible." Aisha laced her fingers with his, her grip firm and warm. "Iron is just a shield. A Seok, you don't need it when you're standing in the light." As the sun fully cleared the edge of the sea, bathing Busan in a brilliant, unapologetic glow, they stood together in the doorway of their new life. There were no guards, no hidden blades, and no secrets left to burn. The harbor light wasn't just the name of the restaurant they were building, it was the truth they had fought for. In the quiet of the morning, among the salt and the waking city, Hwan Seok finally realized that the greatest power he ever possessed wasn't the ability to command fear, but the courage to be seen. They had turned the page, leaving the noir shadows behind to write a story where every meal was a bridge and every word was a promise kept.